Tim, thanks so much for that kind introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. So, what Tim and I want to talk about tonight is a really interesting subject. It's fun because it's very speculative, but at the same time, I think what we're trying to do is ground some of the speculation that is starting to run rife within the academic and expert community, and look at the possibility of Chinese submarine operations in the Arctic from a very operational perspective, and take it down from that sort of 50,000 foot level that experts often look at Chinese Arctic interests. So rather than the big strategic picture, what we want to do is ask, so how would that actually work? So we start with the Arctic, and here's a bit of a paradigm shift. It's a different way of looking at the Arctic. So we throw the Mercator projection out the window. This is the Arctic from the Chinese perspective. So this map comes from the Chinese Arctic and Antarctic Association, and it demonstrates, visually, very quickly, the interest the Chinese have in the North. If you look at it from this perspective, the Arctic is not just a frozen sort of a frozen area of tertiary importance on the other side of the world. It is, in fact, at the very center of the world. It is a potential sea route and strategic nexus from which Chinese vessels can reach Europe, Africa, or North America with a great deal of ease. Now, the Arctic has never been particularly important to non-Arctic states. That's a fairly new phenomenon. And it's actually not just China that is looking at the Arctic in this way. The Arctic Council has a whole suite of new observers, countries as varied as Singapore, South Korea, India, Italy, the EU. They're now looking at the Arctic, trying to gain observer status on the Arctic Council, investing in Arctic research, S&T activity. But what sets China apart is of all of the non-Arctic states beginning to push into the Arctic. It's not just prestige. It's not just a show for China, because China is the only country that is really putting its money where its mouth is. And if you want to know what a state values, don't look at policy statements, look at where the money is going. And the Chinese are spending a great deal of money and paying a great deal of attention. China has one of the largest polar icebreaker fleets in the world, which is surprising for a non-Arctic state. This is the Choi, which has been making Arctic voyages almost every year for the last decade or two. This is Choi 2, not the most creatively named vessel that you've ever seen, but it's a very capable polar icebreaker. The Chinese are also going to be building a third, which rumor has it may or may not be nuclear powered and strong enough to match even the largest Russian icebreaker. So regardless of what happens there, the Chinese are going to have one of the world's most powerful icebreaker fleets in the next several years. The Chinese have been talking about the Arctic for at least the last 10 years. Diplomats, bureaucrats, administrators. In 2018, the Chinese government tied all of this together into its very well written Arctic white paper. And the white paper makes very clear what China's interests are in the North. Science, cooperation, economic development, shipping. The entire paper is phrased along what's called a win-win framework, if you will. China is friendly. They're there to help. They are there to invest and work with the Arctic people. It's the sort of document you would expect to see coming out of, say, the Liberal government of Canada, heavy on Indigenous participation and cooperation. Now, what's noticeably missing from this is any mention of security. And so what, if any, security interests the Chinese have has become an open question within the Western academic, government, and specialist communities. And so what a lot of academics are doing are looking at lower level Chinese conversations taking place within defense journals, military academies, books, speeches, Here's just a few examples that are pulled from Ryan Martinson and Anne-Marie Brady. Their work, they do quite a bit of original Chinese language research, and what comes out of a lot of this conversation is an increasing interest, an operational interest in moving beyond the near seas into the Arctic. And the context matters here. 15 years ago, this would have been all irrelevant, but today what we see is a Chinese Navy which is growing in size and capability and in ambition. No longer just a coastal defense force, China's Navy is very much on the cusp of becoming a blue water fleet. Its 2015 naval strategy has included far seas protection as an official consideration, and of course the national security law that same year added the polar regions as an area of strategic consideration. Closer to China, what we're seeing is also an increased willingness to violate international law and to go against international norms when they can to get their own way. I don't need to brief anyone on what's happening in the South China Sea. And so academics, government officials are projecting what we're seeing in places like the South China Sea into the Arctic. And academics are debating this. So Rob Hubert, who's pictured top left there, debating Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, has been one of the foremost proponents of a China threat emerging as a military threat in the north. So Rob has argued that in fact it's an inevitability, it's Mahanian logic that China, as an emerging blue water state with global interests in the sea lanes of communication, will have to engage in the Arctic. Anne-Marie Brady, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the leading proponents of this as well, talking about fundamental global geostrategic changes that will come about if Chinese submarines in particular begin operating in the north. Now, academics like to argue, and we talk a big talk, but what really catches attention is when world leaders start speaking this way. So this is Mike Pompeo in May 2019, and he addressed to the Arctic Council, and he basically reiterated these fears, telling the assembled circumpolar leaders that the United States was genuinely worried about a Chinese military presence in the north, citing a DoD report from the same year. And so what's behind all of this? What is getting academics and experts and government DoD officials anxious? What is the concern about China projecting power into the north? So what we're going to do is we want to break down the anticipated benefits to China of being there, and then of course talk about why it's probably a little bit more difficult than it looks at face value. So the first, and I would say the most commonly assumed benefit to China of being in the north militarily is the use of the Arctic as a bastion for ballistic missile submarines. This is something that's held up in a lot of different academic work. And in fact, when Pompeo was speaking to the Arctic Council, this was his concern, that a couple of those icebreakers I mentioned earlier may be laying the groundwork, doing the hydrographic work so that strategic ballistic missile submarines will one day have an avenue into the Arctic. And it's easy enough to see why this might be of some value. So what you've got up here is the JL-2 range Chinese ballistic missile submarine, a sub-launch ballistic missile, from roughly speaking the North Pole. As you can see, a submarine based in the Arctic can range pretty much anywhere over North America and Europe as well. Next generation JL-3 has a bit more range. We're not quite sure what that's going to be, but suffice to say it can cover the entire continent. So there's the rationale. It's a central location, and of course, a submarine under the ice is both invulnerable from aerial attack, and because of the ice dynamics and the noises that are made by shifting ice, acoustically tracking them becomes extraordinarily difficult as well. To put that same submarine in the Pacific, you do see why the Arctic presents some advantages. So this is essentially where a Chinese submarine would have to launch missiles, those same JL-2 missiles, with the intent of hitting the eastern seaboard of the United States. So you've got that submarine somewhere between the two main naval bases, the U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet in San Diego and Hawaii. This is an area that is both ice-free and, of course, open, and surrounded by American anti-submarine warfare assets. So that's the attraction of the North as a submarine bastion. There's also the very serious consideration that the North is very soon going to become one of the world's major trade routes. So this is a great little graphic, and whether or not the years are off by 1 to 5 years is irrelevant. What is clearly happening is the Arctic is opening up. It's becoming a sea route, and it's very possible that within a couple of decades, the polar route, not so much the Northwest Passage, but the transpolar route, will become one of the world's leading sea routes. And as a global blue water power, it's clearly in China's interest to either control or at the very least be able to deny access to major sea routes. That's a point Rob Hubert has made in his work. And so it seems simple enough. You've got an obvious bastion for your SSBNs, excellent launch position. You have an emerging sea route. You've got an area that you would like to either control or deny access to the west. And you've got clear access to this area. There's a straight shot pretty much between China and the Arctic. And it seems fairly simple. And that is essentially where a lot of the analysis leaves off. And that's something that we want to delve into a lot more detail. So let's scratch behind that. Let's scratch the surface a little bit. And I'm going to tell you why Tim and I believe that there's a little bit more to it than that. So the world's sea routes as they exist today. Now, naturally, the Arctic is not heavily represented in global traffic, but even as the Arctic begins to melt, and in an ice-free or an ice-reduced Arctic, the value of sea control or denial is often overstated by those academics, experts, government and DoD officials that are really starting to express concern over this. And the rationale for that is twofold. To begin with, the Arctic does not provide the West with any strategic resources that might be necessary in a conflict. The Arctic does not produce a great deal of oil or natural gas or any mineral that we might need. The shipping through the Arctic, even if the region becomes a major sea route and a transshipment hub between Asia, Europe, and the northeastern seaboard of North America, geographically, it does not lend itself to being an ideal place for submarine interdiction. The Arctic is something of an ocean lake bound by very narrow choke points, in particular the Bering Strait. Ocean traffic moving through the Arctic, even if it eventually becomes a serious trade route, all has to hub through the Bering Strait. Now, in the event of conflict, it seems hard to imagine that the submarine would attempt interdiction in the vast ocean rather than those narrow choke points. Trade with China, to begin with, which is most of what would be going through the Bering Strait, would end at the outbreak of a conflict, and most other trade with East Asia would be more easily interdicted close to China or in choke points like Bering. Now, one of the points that James Kraska, an American expert in Arctic security, has made is that sea lift denial is one of the factors which is going to drive the Chinese Navy into the Arctic. And it does make some geographic sense when you first look at it. Deploying warships in an emergency from, say, Norfolk to the Sea of Japan is considerably faster through the Northwest Passage. It's about a 14,000 kilometer trip through the passage, or 19,000 through Panama, or 30,000 around Cape Horn if you've got a big ship that can't fit. Now, one of the problems here, apart from the obvious issues of the choke points, are that the Arctic is a very dangerous place to operate an attack submarine. The traditional route used to and from through the Northwest Passage and into the Pacific hugs the coast. So this is the area that we know. This is the area that we have relatively well charted, the area that strategic sea lift would follow. It's extraordinarily shallow. In many places, you're looking at anywhere from 20 to 60 meters. It is not an ideal place to operate an attack submarine. Likewise, the exit point for strategic sea lift, just like commercial traffic, is the deep waters of the Bering Sea, an area where it is far more easy to interdict sea lift, warships, or commercial vessels. As an SSBN launch point, now there are obvious advantages to operating within the Arctic. However, they're often overstated. It's a difficult place to get into, and Tim is going to talk about that in a moment. And quite frankly, you don't really need to get into there. There's about 35 million square kilometers within the Pacific Ocean, within that red line there, that a Chinese submarine looking to hit the US eastern seaboard with a J-2 missile could hide. It's an enormous amount of space. Now, it's closer to American anti-submarine warfare assets. You can't hide under the ice, but you've got 35 million square kilometers of deep water. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam.
Tim, great.
Awesome. You guys can hear me okay? Great.
Yes.
Okay. First, thanks all for having me. And Tim, if I'd known you're going to read my bio from my website, I would have sent you a more succinct one. But to continue on here, so perhaps one of the final purposes of a Chinese submarine presence in the Arctic would be to help them in their general nuclear deterrent strategy. As you can see here in the upper right slide, the Chinese nuclear arsenal is comparatively small. Only around 290 warheads sitting around distributed between land, sea, and air. And so when we're talking about your secure second strike capability, China doesn't really have much, right? Right now, they've got their 4 ballistic missile submarines. Odds are only 1 or 2 are going to be in operation at any one time. And so you're left with what? Currently it's only 1 warhead per missile, and you have 2 submarines, each carrying 16 missiles or so. So you don't have a lot. Don't have a lot of warheads that can reliably strike the United States, especially given the new ongoing efforts for the Americans at developing their anti-ballistic missile defense system, right? And right now they're sitting at somewhere around 60 interceptors sitting in Alaska. And so 60 is gonna, assuming a perfect hit ratio, which is never gonna really happen, but let us assume that, it means that the Chinese, 40 some odd second strike missiles have a very low probability of success in that so-called best case scenario. And so for China to actually really make the best use of those 40 warheads, they're really going to want to try to nullify the American ballistic missile defense system. And so there are 2 main sites in Alaska. The first one is Clear Air Force Station, and you see that in a drawing of one in the middle picture there. And since we're Canadians, maybe interested to know, this is this American long-range discrimination radar, and it's brand new. It's currently just being built by Lockheed Martin, and the technology that goes in that is actually exactly the same technology that's going to go into Canada's own surface combatant for our radars. And so, ours will obviously be much smaller, and they won't see as far, not with as much detail, but it's the same technology. And so there's sort of interesting relationship there. But that aside, so that's one target, and you see in the bottom the little map there, that's the blue, and the blue dot there, that's where Clear Air Force Station is. Now further out to the east is the green dot, that's Fort Greely, and that's where all the actual interceptor missiles are based out of, for the American ballistic missile defense system, at least the ones in Alaska. And so these 2 targets are obviously sort of prime candidates for any kind of Chinese strike. They want to make sure they take these down so that their retaliatory strikes with the nuclear missiles can actually get through. And so we're thinking, well, it might be a good idea to go up to the Arctic, do some cruise missiles through to destroy these ballistic missile defense systems early before the retaliatory strike happens, either as an actual matter of course or as part of the current deterrence discussion. And so you look at a map and you see the distance is relative to the shorelines, right? It's much farther to shoot at these bases from the Arctic than it is from Alaska down the south. And so, given the current, Chinese cruise missile capabilities, they don't even actually have the range to strike these sites from the Arctic. They can strike them, if they really stretch the range from the coast, the southern coast, but not from the Arctic. And of course, you can say, yes, in the future, the Chinese will likely develop a Tomahawk-type missile with much longer range that can do it. Yes, okay, so that's a possibility. But then, as we'll talk about shortly, there's another issue that comes up with that, and that's the matter of actually testing the air underwater. So, that's the final bit of, what might a Chinese submarine present in the Arctic use for, and that's the final one. And again, much like as Adam has mentioned earlier, it's not a very convincing sort of a role for an Arctic submarine. Adam, can go next slide. Thanks. So now we're going to talk about the Arctic and why it's actually quite difficult to actually operate. And some of you turn off your mic. Thank you, I think. Yes, that'll do it. So here we have a map from one of the earlier American nuclear submarines that tried to sail through the Bering Strait and into the Arctic. And you can see, it doesn't look like it's drawn to scale, but in fact it is. And you see there, the Sargo, one of the first American submarines, squeaking by just underneath packed ice with a bunch of, undulating, what they call ice keels. That's really limiting how much sealing they have. And then at the bottom, you have, the seabed. And so we're really talking about a 51-foot tall submarine from keel to sails. It's 51 feet tall. It's working within a space that's less than 60 feet deep. Okay, so you have beneath the submarine, you have maybe 5 feet, and above the submarine, you have 4 feet to work with. So you're squeaking by, slowly crawling along, trying to get through this long passageway to get through the Bering Strait and get through the Bering Sea into the Arctic. It is not an easy phenomenon. Now, this is, of course, in winter, and in the summertime, much of this will go away, but if you want to maintain a credible deterrent, you want to make sure you actually can get through at any time of the year. So it's one of those funny things where in the development of American submarines and really submarines anywhere is that there's a tendency to go big submarines. Submarine sizes have gone increasingly larger over the last 50 years. And ironically, that's actually not very good for Arctic operations. You want small ones that can actually maneuver under and between all this ice in the Arctic. And so this has been described as by one author as a small boy squirming under a low-hanging fence. And I think this chart here, the graph, really shows you all the uncertainties involved in transiting through the Arctic. And for comparison's sake, the current class ballistic missile submarines that Chinese have, they're 135 meters long and they're 63.5 feet from keel to sail. So they're even taller, wider than what space is available under the worst of winter conditions inside the Bering Strait. And so they're going to have to maneuver, and maneuvering in those waters are going to be incredibly challenging because unlike the seabed, the sea ice is constantly shifting, it's constantly changing. No amount of hydrographical research into winter icebreakers is going to prepare you to navigate blindly through these ice-covered waters. You're going to have to figure out, as you're sailing through it, in a very active manner, where those ice fields are, where this ice jungle is, and what path is safe for you as you're sailing forward. Next, please. Of course, this problem of shallow waters isn't just in the Bering Strait itself; it's also in the Arctic Basin, or not quite the basin, but the area and the approaches through that Arctic Basin. So, we go back one slide. Yeah, so you can see all that light blue there, and at the bottom of it, you can see what those colors mean. We're talking about an Arctic where a significant amount of those waters are well under 50 50 meters or so. And so we're talking again about large submarines in very shallow waters with potentially very thick and uncertain ice that's above them. And so in order to navigate through that, then, Adam, next, you're gonna have to be really using all your technologies to figure out how to navigate through this. And so on the top left picture is probably like the standard vision that people might have about sailing underneath, Arctic sea ice. It's fairly flat. It's not particularly interesting. All the ice does is cover you. It's block you from air access. It doesn't, don't really worry about it once you're under it. But Adam, can you click the video in the middle? And so here's a video camera, a low light video camera from the American as it's sailing underneath some of this ice that's in the Arctic. As we're sailing through, you'll note it's looking upwards, and it is very uneven. It's very big there. It's sharp, it's pointy, it's incredibly hard. And all of this happens because, as the ice shifts in the north, they're forced to compact and press against each other, and some of it goes up, most of it goes down. And when the ice compresses and goes down, it's just it's incredibly uncertain. And as you're sailing through it, the only way you can know where all these ice fields are in order to navigate properly is to go active with your sonar. And for those of you, I don't have to tell you, you're all experienced people in the naval realm. You know what in the submarine going active with your sonar, what that means for your capability. It means anybody nearby is going to hear that you're there, and you become incredibly vulnerable to detection. And so in order to navigate through the Arctic, you're going to have to basically expose yourself every time you do it. And if you don't, well, you can see in the picture on the right what happens. And that's here's a Sargo coming back from his first Arctic trip, with a banged up sail at the top there because it hit some of those ice fields, and basically the bow sonar window, which was covered in rubber back then, it's been ripped away from collisions with ice. And so even though they actually hardened the sails for these submarines, you can't harden everything. And the ice in some cases is even tougher than the best steel they had at that time. And so you hear the old adage that 90% of an iceberg is underwater. Well, not quite 90% for some of these ice fields and ice jungles, but pretty close. And you don't know where they are unless you're actually thinking around, thinking, look for them. And to go deep, deep, deep. Next, please. Right, so, that's the whole concern with, making yourself heard by going active with your sonar. It only matters if there's someone there to actually hear you. And so you're thinking, well, are there actual, Western systems up there in the Arctic that can actually, hear a Chinese submarine trying to sneak through that region? And so here are the two photographs in the middle on the left. They are a fairway rock that sits roughly on it sits off the coast of Alaska in the Bering Strait, just off the coast there. And on the picture on the left there, that is one of the radioisothermic reactors. Basically, it's the same kind of radioactive battery, if you will, that powers spacecraft. So when they don't have any sun, they can actually still run. And so it operates on basis of radioactive decay and provides energy, and in this case, it provides electricity to a wide number of unspecified underwater sensors in that region. Supposedly it's for science and hydrography, but this project was sponsored by the U.S. Arctic Submarine Lab, so it's more than just for environmental studies. And so that was there up until sort of the early 90s, and then they started dismantling that project. So you're thinking, well, that means it may no longer be there, and so nobody's really watching the Bering Strait. But then you come across interesting posting over on LinkedIn, of all places, by Sandia National Laboratories, one of the top American military science installations. And guess what they're looking for? A postdoc in distributed acoustic sensing in the Arctic Ocean. And look at that, even says right there, in addition, we will also track boat activity in the Arctic. Of course, are talking about boats as in surface boats or boats as in submarines? We're not quite sure, but nevertheless, acoustic sensing in the Arctic remains a prime concern to the Americans, and they're actively working on it. And as far as, of course, the more famous underwater sensing system goes, explosives, the Aleutian Islands off Alaska was one of the termination points for a series of sensors in that region. So you know that that sensor network was, at least until fairly active recently, was in place, and the Americans have been monitoring it for at least quite a while. And so the access point for any Chinese submarine to the Arctic is well monitored, or at least has the potential to be very easily reinstalled and reactivated should the need proceed to arise, have risen. So you've got submarines that can only really operate in the Arctic if they make themselves known, and you have the Americans have the systems that could hear them if they decide to do so. So not a particularly attractive option either way. Next page. And so now we talk. Okay, so let us assume that somehow magically new technologies evolve, and the Chinese can figure out how to navigate through unpredictable ice keels with non-acoustic, non-active measures, perhaps through salinity or pressure in the water or light, really sensitive light sensors. Okay. Well, you still need the hulls to make a reasonable prospect. Okay. So China has a lot of submarines. There's no doubt that. There's numbers range of 50 something to 60 something, and yeah, very impressive. But looking at the chart here, roughly 2018, from one analyst, I took the liberty of highlighting the ones in green are the nuclear-powered submarines that I know are in service, and then the ones in red are the nuclear submarines that are currently either being built or are currently being decommissioned, or their status is unknown. And so, the green and the red, you add them together, it's still not a lot. It's still a fairly small amount of the total Chinese submarine force. The vast majority, of course, SSKs, these are electric powered, some with AIP, air independent propulsion. But in the end of the day, in terms of the amount of Chinese submarines available for Arctic operations, that is nuclear ones, it's an incredibly small amount. You've got 6 attack submarines and 4.5 ballistic missile submarines. And so if you want to have an enduring, rotating, constant Arctic presence, that you need a lot more than this to make that happen, right? And so right now we don't have the numbers, and in fact, even the Americans connect the Chinese to actually build up their nuclear-powered submarine fleet up until perhaps like 2030s or so, when they'll go up beyond more than a dozen or so for their SSNs. Next, please. So why does only nuclear matter? Because I know you guys have or NAC will be hosting a future conference on conventional submarine options for the Arctic, and that's certainly one option that always gets proposed here in Canada, right? We know that Canadians hate the notion of having a nuclear-powered anything, whether it's a land nuclear power plant or whether it's a submarine, as we heard back in the late 80s. And so everyone's thinking, well, we would very much like to have an Arctic submarine capability. And it seems that the new notion of air independent propulsion or conventional powered submarines, that seems like a good idea. It seems like a solid way to go about doing things. Okay, it's interesting. But the problem with AIP is that while it drastically prolongs their ability to stay underwater by consuming fuels that don't require air, they only have so much if you are actually sailing quite slowly. And so you often see, endurance, AIP extends your endurance underwater measured in time, right? Measured in days, measured in weeks. Some even go as long as a month. But what they rarely tell you, what the companies rarely tell you, is at what speed that's operating at. What they're really talking about, most of these things, you're crawling along at a fairly sedate pace of 5 knots or so, to get that, at least that, 3 week, 1 month duration underwater. And when you're in the Arctic, one of the issues that you want to actually get through the surface somehow. You want to actually be able to, communicate with the open air, communicate with satellites, receive transmissions, send your intelligence reports, or in the worst case scenario, actually allow your cruise missiles or ballistic missiles to actually fire into the air. In order for you to do this, you need areas of shallow ice, right? Very thin ice or non-existent ice, what are known as polynyas, right? And so you have to find these things. And again, much like ice fields themselves, they're very uncertain as to where they are. To some extent, you're sort of predictable in a wide area, but you still have to really, once you're there, navigate, figure out where they are. and then go through them. And so as you're sailing through the Arctic, you have to keep in mind where these polynyas are. And so that, when time comes to actually access that air, you can get there in time to actually do that kind of thing. Actually navigate, communicate, fire missiles, collect intelligence, deliver intelligence. So you need to be able to access these polynyas within a timely manner. And so speed matters then in such a case. And that's going to eat deeply into your AIP fuel reserves. And not to mention that, once those fuel reserves are depleted, you're stuck with using diesel. And when you're using diesel, you're going to have to also access the open air. And again, imagine, if you're running low on both, if you've ran out of AIP, you're running low on batteries, there's still ice above you, you don't know, you're trying to find that last polynya you found. And what if this just happens to be just a little bit out of reach of your AIP fuel reserves? And you're kind of screwed, aren't you? So again, this is why nuclear propulsion remains, for now, really the only feasible option for an Arctic submarine. So I think that's that section. Adam?
Thanks, Tim. So we have, given our take on why operating the Arctic is a lot more dangerous than is commonly assumed. But more than that, why the West is not nearly as vulnerable as we're always made out to be in the Arctic. So the natural conclusion from everything we've said is that there's no possibility of a Chinese submarine presence. So to take this in a completely different direction, I want to talk about the voyage of USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine to make the transit under the Arctic Ocean. So the Nautilus went through in 1958 after the Russian satellite Sputnik went up. Now, the Nautilus was actually less of an operational voyage and more of a publicity stunt. It was an attempt by the United States to demonstrate technical prowess in the face of that Russian success. The first submarine voyage was more about politics than about operational capability or strategic value. With this in mind, what I would suggest is, despite what we've said, there is still real value to the Chinese government in deploying submarines to the north. If not necessarily in an operational role against Canada or the United States, then perhaps as political symbolism. The Chinese Navy has been used in recent years as a demonstration of Chinese state power and technical capability. Deployments to East Africa have been highlighted in Chinese state media. A voyage to the Arctic is not exactly out of the question. There's also one other Arctic that we haven't talked about. And apart from Rob Hubert, who does talk about this in his recent piece, no other Arctic scholar really pays any attention to any Arctic apart from the North American Arctic. Now we assume, because we're talking about the Chinese, a competitor of the West, that any target must be the West. If we shift our gaze a little bit, it's actually fairly interesting to realize all of the vulnerabilities that I talked about us not having in the North American Arctic are very present in the Russian Arctic. While there is no oil and gas production of any strategic value in our Arctic, there very much is for the Russian Arctic. While there's limited shipping value in the Canadian Arctic, there absolutely is in the Russian Arctic. So ironically, the target, or at least the viable operational target of any Chinese submarine deployments to the Arctic, may not even be the West at all. If you look at this map, this gives you a very rough approximation of the range of Chinese submarine-launched cruise missiles. 4 Chinese submarines positioned either in the Barents Sea or somewhere north of Wrangel Island in the Far East could shut down the entire northeastern sea route. The Russian oil and gas industry that you can see lined up here, the Yamal Peninsula, that area consists of roughly 80–90% of Russia's natural gas exports. About 12% of Russia's oil is now produced in that region alone. The Barents Sea and the Kara Sea area is the future of Russia's oil and gas production. The Arctic, from an economic perspective, for Canada and the United States, simply put, is not all of that important. For Russia, it is existential. Russian shipping along the northern sea route is significant. Minerals, hydrocarbon, cargo, tens of millions of tons transit this route every year. 30 million tons in 2019, with plans to increase that to 80 million tons by 2025. So this is just an interesting way of shifting our perspective. We think of Chinese submarine deployments to the north, and we just instinctively assume that this is a threat to the west. Well, the reality is, I hope Tim and I have laid out, North America is not that vulnerable from the Arctic. Russia is. Which brings me to the Western response. If we find ourselves one day waking up to see one of those Chinese submarines having transited the Arctic, perhaps as a political statement more than a military operation, how do we perceive this and how do we respond? The overarching message we would leave is don't overreact. One, China's intent in the Arctic is not necessarily as clear-cut as it's sometimes made out to be. Are they using this as a missile launching position, a cruise missile strike position? Are they looking for sea denial? Well, not necessarily. Are they even there to challenge the West? Not necessarily. Assets sent north are unavailable in areas of greater importance. Now, what that means is that it's very possible that one Chinese submarine popping up in the North Pole will have a massive, outsized importance if Western countries, the United States in particular, overreact and begin to deploy valuable resources into the Arctic to lock that area down. Because we live in a zero-sum game where every dollar sent north is a platform that is not in the South China Sea, is not in the seas around Taiwan and Guam. Now, conversely, there is even benefit to the West, as bizarre as it sounds, to these potential theoretical Chinese submarine deployments in two ways. It bites both ways. As Tim said, there are a limited number of Chinese nuclear platforms, and every one of those valuable assets in the Arctic is one that is not on the West Coast, that is not in East Asia. That dispersal of Chinese assets is valuable to us. The presence of Chinese submarines in the Arctic may even be politically valuable. Russia and China have grown I don't want to say alliance, but let's say friendship. They have become strong frenemies. Anything that can throw a wrench in that developing friendship is actually of value to the West. And while the Arctic is not of existential value to us, it is to the Russians. The shipping, the resource development, without that, the Russian economy collapses. And so the Russian military is going to be very averse to any Chinese military presence. So in that sense, it might almost be something that could benefit us. So I'll leave you with that provocative statement, and I'm very happy to take questions, or Tim and I will.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to stop recording the session now as we go into question and answers.